Good evening. Well, voting season is upon us. And if you're like me, you've probably received more glossy brochures than you wanted to. Thankfully, it's also bonfire season, so there's a useful purpose to them. Paper makes good kindling. But if you've noticed any of these brochures, they all seem to say the same thing. A lot of politicians making the same claims: safer schools, bring jobs, make it easier for small businesses, go to Jefferson City or Washington to stand up for us. Now, anyone can say those things, but as we know, talk is cheap. And the question is, who can actually deliver the goods? Don't tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what you've actually done. Tell me how you're going to do this. Tell me how you've already voted. What you've done in the community to make these goals a reality. Because anyone can say it, but the real question is, who can deliver the goods? Now, thus far in our study of Mark, we've seen a lot of big claims about Jesus. Mark calls him Christ, the Son of God. John says that he baptizes with the Holy Spirit. There was a voice from heaven that said very dramatically that this is my beloved Son. Jesus himself claims to have authority to forgive sin. Those are big claims. But other religions claim as much. There are other deities that make grand claims in this world. There have been other claimants to the title of Christ or Messiah. Anyone can say these things. The question is, who can deliver the goods? Who can back up their words with suitably divine actions? Jesus can. And that is what we're going to see tonight in Mark. So our passage is going to be Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through chapter 6, verse 6, the first half of verse 6. In this passage, we'll see that Jesus' identity comes to light in four ways. As he demonstrates his power over the natural realm, as he demonstrates his power over the supernatural realm, as he demonstrates his power over disease and death, and as he demands a faith-filled response. Just before this passage starts, Jesus has chosen disciples, and he's begun to teach them in parables. Now he's going to show them in unmistakable clarity his identity and who it is that he called them to follow. So let's dive in. Verses 35 to 41 of chapter 4, Jesus' identity comes to light as he demonstrates his power over the natural realm. Now, this section begins with Jesus on the move. He's encouraging his disciples to keep moving. Let's be going. Let us go over to the other side, he says to them. And this fits in very well with what Mark has already taught us about Jesus. Jesus is a man on a mission. Chapter 1, verse 38, Jesus told us what that mission is. He is here for a purpose. Let us go somewhere else, to the towns nearby, so that I may preach there also. For that is what I came for. So Jesus is continually driven by the mission to preach the gospel all over. And that is what drives the narrative forward. He is continuing to fulfill his purpose. But as he is seeking to fulfill this purpose, he is in this boat with his disciples on the Sea of Galilee. And it's a small boat stuck in the middle of a massive windstorm. The disciples are terrified of this windstorm. Remember, these are men who are fishermen. They are used to being on this lake, but evidently this is a windstorm of a proportion that they have never experienced before. These rough fishermen who can take a lot are terrified out of their wits about this storm. Mark himself gives us some hints that the situation looks pretty grim. It says that the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Now, when we're talking about this boat, modern archaeology has amazingly found a very well preserved boat from the time of Jesus that they found in the mud of the Sea of Galilee. So we have some idea of what a boat like this would have been like, a fisherman's boat. And roughly, it would be about the size of this platform, actually probably a little smaller than this platform, just a small wooden boat that these men are in as they are sailing across the lake. So it's not very big. It's not like this massive thing. It's small, it's flimsy, and it's scary. It's very scary to be on the boat. It's almost impossible to conceive of how terrifying this would be. Just imagine. You're in a boat that rolls back and forth. 1 minute you're swinging to the one side. The next moment you're swinging to the other. You can't walk straight. You're constantly almost losing your balance. You have to hold on to things in order to not be swept overboard, perhaps. The boat would come up to the crest of the wave comes, the front of the boat comes up, and then as the wave passes underneath, the front drops down very violently. And then the next wave comes and probably splashes right over the front and engulfs the boat in a great deal of water. And so it's this constant up and down, splash, up, down, splash. Terrifying to be in, and there's no way out of this situation. This is like turbulence on an airplane, but a whole lot worse. In fact, one modern sailor has described the experience of being on a ship in a storm. Let me just tell you what he said it was like. He said, the whole ship looks like a matchbox, floating in a ding-dong manner with no control of the ship itself. The existence of the ship becomes a big question mark. You just can't stand. The ship's speed gets drastically reduced as the ship has to face the whirlwinds and splashes of waves. Our movement becomes jerky, and we need to hold on to something to move. It is a seriously scary situation, as no one talks to anyone, and the sign of fear is well marked on faces. And in this terrifying situation, the disciples come to Jesus. And here we notice the most remarkable part of this passage is to see what Jesus is doing. He's sleeping on a cushion. Now, what sort of cushion did fishermen have in their boats? Probably this is a bag filled with sand for ballast. So probably not the most luxurious cushion that Jesus is asleep on, but Jesus is simply asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" I want you to notice how little it took for Jesus, a man of faith, to rest in the storm. He has confidence in God, and he has a sandbag for ballast, and he can sleep through this storm. But they wake him. Don't you care? There's an implication there if you didn't notice. The implication is it doesn't look like you do care, Jesus. Come on. Where are you? Do you not care about us? Jesus does something remarkable. He gets up, he rebukes the wind and the waves. And this strikes us as odd. We would expect for Jesus to get up and then fall on his knees, lift his hands to heaven and plead with God, "God, please stop the storm." But he doesn't. He just says, "Hush, be still." There's no calling on God. It's as if the power is innate. He simply commands. And it happens. This power is within himself. And then he turns to them with a rebuke. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Now I want you to notice there's a contrast here. It's a contrast that we see throughout this section of Mark. As we keep going, we'll see it again and again. It's the contrast between fear versus faith. The disciples respond with fear. Jesus expects faith from them. And there's this constant tension between the one or the other. How do the disciples respond? How should people respond to the circumstances of life? With fear or with faith in God? Now, of course, we could give Jesus a pass. We could say, well, of course, Jesus knew that everything would be okay. He's God, right? But the disciples, we can't give them the same pass. So Jesus expects them to have faith. What was it that the disciples were supposed to cling on to that could give them a confidence in the midst of this terrifying storm? What could their faith hold on to? as everything else is rolling around in the boat? Well, the disciples could reason it out for themselves. And Martin Lloyd-Jones has done a good job of listing out the steps of what the disciples could have reasoned out and what we can reason out in the various circumstances of life. They could simply reason out, first, God is concerned about me as my Father, and nothing happens to me apart from God. Even the very hairs of my head are all numbered. I must never forget that. And also, God's will and God's ways are a great mystery, but I know that whatever he wills or permits is of necessity for my good. Third, every situation in life is the unfolding of some manifestation of God's love and goodness. Therefore, my business is to look for this peculiar manifestation of God's goodness and kindness, and to be prepared for surprises and blessings, because his ways are not my ways, neither his thoughts my thoughts. Therefore, I must regard circumstances and conditions not in and of themselves, therefore, but as a part of God's dealings with me in the work of perfecting my soul and bringing me to final perfection. Finally, whatever my conditions may be at this present moment, they are only temporary, they are only passing, and they can never rob me of the joy and the glory that ultimately await me in Christ. That's the essence of what the disciples could have gone back to. They could have reasoned it out in their mind, and the end result of thinking through these basic facts of God's sovereignty and of God's fatherhood was that they could have endured this storm with faith. And Jesus questions, why didn't you? There's this contrast. Fear of what could happen, or faith in God and what God ordains. We don't really know how the disciples think about this rebuke. They don't seem to give any response to it. Instead, they become terrified in a different way. They were terrified of the storm. Now they have a different kind of fear. And they begin to question among themselves. The question that becomes kind of the overriding question of this whole section of text, which is, who then is this? That even the wind and the sea obey him. For the first time, it seems, ever, the disciples come face to face with the reality that Jesus is more than a remarkable teacher. He's more than just a miracle worker. He's more than a powerful preacher. He is a absolutely astonishing being with power to control wind and waves. Who is he? What is his identity? Jesus' identity comes to light as he demonstrates his power over the supernatural realm. In the next story, chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, his identity comes to light as he demonstrates his power over the supernatural realm. They finally arrive on the other side of the sea, and they come to the country of the Gerasenes, a Gentile land. This is a land of darkness. People don't even pretend to follow the laws of God. And what happens next is undoubtedly one of the most intense demonic encounters of Jesus' life that we have recorded for us. Everything about this passage highlights the dark and fearful power of the demon horde that inhabits this man. Notice several things here. He is a man who lives in the tombs. He lives in a graveyard. That's where all spooky stories begin. He's indwelt by this horde of evil spirits. Now the word that Matthew gives is that this is an unclean spirit. So this is probably a man who is continually racked by immoral and obscene thoughts and actions. He's stronger than chains and shackles. Pounds of iron do nothing to control his strength. In fact, even the strongest people, the policemen of the community, can't keep this man under control. He is so strong. And if you don't ever know where he is, all you have to do is be very quiet, and you can probably hear him screaming from a long ways away. That's where you know. That's how you know where he is. He does this day and night, screaming. Terrifying. And last but not least, he's continually walking around. He's like a walking sore He's slicing himself with rocks to try to relieve the torment of his soul. This is a seriously disturbed individual, and everything about this is demonstrating how terrifying, how fearful, how powerful this demon is that has taken its residence in this man. He's also a man who lives in a permanent state of uncleanness. Not only is he living in Gentile land, but he's living in the tombs, which was a very defiled place for Jewish people. He's indwelt by unclean demons. So if there's anyone that we would think of as beyond the hope of reformation, it would clearly be this individual. We could rightly call him the walking dead. But as soon as he sees Jesus, something remarkable happens. He starts sprinting toward him. Now, if you were one of the disciples, just imagine the scene. The boat pulls up on the shore, you get out, Jesus is there, and you see this crazy man running full speed towards you. What are you going to do? I know what I'd probably do. I'd be backing up. I'd be getting into the boat, trying to get away. But when he arrives, he doesn't attack, he doesn't do anything except fall down before Jesus. This demon recognizes the power of Jesus. This is a powerful demon, no doubt about it, but here is an even greater power that has entered the territory of the Gadarenes. And these demons, notice this. Verse 7, shouting with a loud voice. He said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Did you see how in the last verse of chapter 4, the disciples are asking the question, who then is this? Here are these disciples who've spent a lot of time already with Jesus. They've seen him do some miracles already. They have listened to his parables, and they're like, who is he? And here you have a demon horde, running up to him in no doubt about the identity of Jesus. They know exactly who he is. He is Jesus, Son of the Most High God. No question there. Jesus asks for the name of this demon, and the name that is given is Legion, for we are many. Now, a legion was a section of the Roman army. A legion normally consisted of around 5,200 men. And the point of this, using this name, is not to give an exact number of these demons, but simply to give the realization that Jesus is not simply facing one demon. This is a vast opposing force. This is not one-on-one battle. This is a whole army of demons that Jesus is confronting right here. But despite their vast power and their vast number, they prostrate themselves before Jesus. They recognize his identity, and they recognize his power over them because they begin begging him for mercy. This man, through these demons, begins to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And Jesus very graciously accepts their request, and he does not send them out of the country. He sends them instead to a herd of pigs. Now, we don't know how many pigs there are. There's a lot of pigs. It's probably normal herds of this size were 200 or 300 at least. And these demons rush into the pigs. The pigs then rush over a cliff and drown in the sea. Which is kind of ironic because the demons don't want to be judged. They said, don't torment us. They are asking to have the judgment deferred, and yet in a sense they receive the judgment by having the pigs drowned in the sea. So there's a sense in which judgment is already being conferred on these evil spirits. But when the townspeople hear the news, they come back and they see something that they had never dreamed they would ever see. Here is that man. Not just any man, that man. And he is sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind. He's calm. He's sane. He's reasonable. He's almost the sort of man that if you had a problem, you would pick up your phone and call him and say, hey, what should I do? Give me some advice. Because he thinks so clearly. He's just a logical person now. He can think things through. And they're amazed by this. This is the immense power that Jesus has over the supernatural realm. I remember several years ago, I was in the very southern part of Texas, and I met a gentleman who had an immense fear of the demonic. He had, at some low point in his life, been introduced to a demonic figure that he referred to as the goddess of vengeance. And because he had been promised that if he would worship this being, he would receive many blessings, he had kissed this idol. And as a result, his life had changed in very dramatic ways. According to him, this figure had promised to improve his life if he would worship it, and to ruin his life if he would not, if he ever turned away from the worship of this being. And the stories that he told were pretty supernatural. And I had the opportunity to share the gospel with him, and I told him about Jesus, and I explained how Jesus' power is able to overcome the power of any demonic force. But at the end of the day, he didn't want to follow Jesus because he was too afraid of what demonic forces could do in his life if he stopped serving them. And I think that a passage like this is not designed to teach us all of the things that we want to know about the supernatural realm. It's not trying to give us a PhD in demonology. What it is doing is it's giving us a confidence, and it's giving to all people a confidence that whatever forces are out there, whatever demonic forces may exist in the world, there is a greater force. There is a greater power, Jesus Christ, whose authority is so much greater than that of any other supernatural forces that may exist. And Jesus has the power to take this man whose life has been ruined and make him to be sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind. But do the townspeople accept Jesus? No, they don't. They fear. But they don't have faith. Once again, we see this contrast. There's fear versus faith. The people wanted to see. They all came out of the town. They're like, really, we want to see Jesus. We want to see this man and what has happened. But they're only interested in this man as a curiosity. They're interested in these things in the same sense that you might be interested to visit Ripley's Believe It or Not museum. It's interesting to visit. You can see some cool stuff, but only if the ticket price is small enough. They don't actually want their lives changed. They don't want Jesus to continue with them. And so they ask him to go. There's a fear that they have. They recognize, they are in no doubt that there is an awesome power in their midst. Here is Jesus who just overcame the legion of demons. But these people are scared by this power. Better to live without such awesome power in their midst. Just like Tolkien's Aslan, such a powerful being is good, but certainly not safe. And most would rather live without him. And Jesus responds by leaving. He doesn't protest. We actually see this as a form of judgment on these people. Sometimes God's judgment on you is when he doesn't make you listen to the truth that you don't want to hear. And that's what happens. They don't get Jesus in their midst at their own request. The man wants to follow Jesus, and Jesus sends him back. Tell people what God has done for you. Sometimes maybe we have ways that we want to serve Jesus. We want to do things for him. We want to minister in this way or that way. It's not always given to us. What we can always do is what this man is directed to do. To go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. So what has God done for you? And how can you glorify Jesus by reporting that? So we've seen that Jesus' identity, it comes to light first as he demonstrates his power over the natural realm, And then as he demonstrates his power over the supernatural realm, there's a third way that his identity comes to light. Verses 21 to 43, he demonstrates his power over disease and death. As the story goes on, there's a man, a synagogue official. His name is Jairus, and he has a desperate situation. His little daughter is on the verge of death. But if Jesus would just come and lay his hands on her, she will be healed. And Jesus agrees to come. And at this point, the story kind of shifts gear away from Jairus to another woman. This woman has had a discharge of blood that has been continuous for 12 years. Now, verse 26 is all about painting how desperate the situation is. Here is a woman who has sought every help that physicians can give. If we were to put this story in modern terms, she has flown to the East Coast and the West Coast to see the top doctors in the nation. She's gone to the Mayo Clinic. She's gone all these different places to seek the best experts in medical care that exist. And the end result is that not only is she not any better, but she used all of her money and actually has grown worse. So she is in a desperate situation. She's had this unpleasant discharge of blood. She is in chronic anemia, so she's constantly fatigued and tired because that's what happens when you lose blood like that. And on top of that, according to the Levitical laws, her condition leaves her ritually impure so that she cannot join with her countrymen and countrywomen in the public worship of God. She is an outcast in this society. But what she does have, in verse 28, is a remarkable faith. If I just touch his garments, I will get well. She is certain of that. And she does it. She approaches from behind, she touches his garments, and instantly she is healed. Now, Jesus turns around quickly and he says, "Who touched my garments?" The way that he says it actually implies that he knows who it is. So to us, we're like, and to the disciples, knowing that there's a crowd of people, they're like, "What do you mean, who touched your garments?" As if maybe someone in general. But Jesus, Mark implies, knows exactly who it is that touched his garments. And when he sees her, she, fearing and trembling, aware of what happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Jesus blesses her and her faith. "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." In other words, when Jesus sees true faith being exercised, he blesses it. In this woman's case, in a very remarkable way, in a very powerful and miraculous way. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that every difficulty in life that you entrust to Jesus will immediately become better. God doesn't give us that promise. The promise that he does give us is that when we entrust our problems to Jesus, there is a blessing that comes with that in every single situation. And this woman receives this very miraculous blessing to show what always happens when people trust their problems to Jesus. As Jesus reminds us in Matthew 7, when we ask for good gifts, God doesn't always give us the good gift we request, but it's always a good gift that he gives. Now, you might remember last week, Mike Hoffman was going through part of Mark, and he pointed out there's this interesting device that Mark uses called the Mark-on sandwich, where he takes one story and there's another story inside. It's kind of like the cream inside the donut. You kind of take a break from the donut to get to the cream, and then you get back to the donut. Or we could think of it a different way, kind of like a commercial break, except it's not a commercial. But that's kind of what's going on. We have the story of Jairus, and then we have this commercial break for this woman. There's just one little problem. Jairus doesn't have time for a commercial break. His daughter is on the verge of death. In fact, the commercial break turns out to be fatal for his daughter. By the time this scene ends, some messengers have arrived and they said, it's too late. Your daughter's died. Why trouble the teacher anymore? This is finally a problem that's too big for Jesus to handle. You gave it your best, you came to him, but hope is gone. It's more than can be expected. And here again we have that contrast between fear and faith. Because Jesus actually, in a very remarkable, very unexpected way, Jesus himself undertakes to help this man's faith. And he says, do not be afraid any longer, only believe. Again, that contrast. Faith versus fear. And Jesus calls on Jairus to renounce his fear and to move forward in faith. Now, I've mentioned this several times because I think that Mark really is highlighting this contrast for us. And it almost sounds cliche. Faith over fear. We hear that sentiment sometimes. But we don't mean this. Mark doesn't mean this in the cliche way of general faith. This is faith in God, in Jesus Christ. In Jesus as the Son of God. And in every situation in life, God's will for you is not fear, but is faith in his sovereignty under the control and authority of Jesus Christ. So you ask, how does Mark 4 through 6 apply to me? I'll tell you very directly, very specifically how this passage applies to you. What are you afraid of in life? What are you fearful of? That is where this passage applies to you. It is in that fear that Jesus would say to you, do not be afraid any longer, only believe. God does not call us to a spirit of fear, but instead to this trust and recognition of God's sovereignty over all things through the authority of Jesus Christ. And that is how this passage speaks to every one of us. Now, the emphasis of verses 39 through 40 is that these people know that the girl is dead. There's no question about it. Jesus comes and they are making a commotion, they are weeping, and when Jesus challenges them on whether or not she is dead, they start to laugh because they're not idiots. They know someone's dead when they see someone who has truly died. This is a culture that can recognize a dead person. The lines from The Princess Bride don't apply here. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Mostly dead is slightly alive, and this young girl is all dead. She's not mostly dead. And that's the point here. But Jesus, even though he knows that she is all dead, also knows that she is not permanently dead. Faith is being exercised, and that is a reason for hope. Notice again how Jesus heals, resurrects this girl. Not by falling on his knees and praying to God, not through some complicated ritual in the same way that Elisha once raised a boy from the dead, but simply through 2 words in her native tongue. Talitha kum. Girl, arise. Again, remarkably, Jesus has an innate power even over disease and death itself. Now, the purpose of giving her food proved that this girl was really raised. She was not simply a phantom or a spirit. She is a flesh and blood human being, and that's why he encourages them to give her food. The result, though, is that these disciples and all the people who hear about it are completely astonished. There is nothing that shakes them now, or that should shake you of the conviction that Jesus has all power. The natural realm, the supernatural realm, disease and death itself, all of it is under the control of Jesus Christ. And therefore, he is worth believing. One point I want to mention is that 12 years earlier, this girl had been born. And 12 years earlier, this woman had developed a discharge of blood. For 12 years, God was working, and God was permitting great difficulty to go on in one woman's life. One girl would live for 12 years before dying. One woman would have a discharge for 12 years. Both cases, God was for a long time in the work in order to glorify his son Jesus. So Jesus' identity comes to light as he demonstrates his power over the natural realm, over the supernatural realm, over disease and death. But finally, in verses 1 through the first half of chapter 6, we see that Jesus' identity comes to light as he demands a faith-filled response. He comes back to his hometown, which Mark never puts a lot of emphasis on where Jesus is from, so he doesn't give us the name of Nazareth, but that's where it is. His disciples follow him, and Jesus, on the Sabbath, teaches in the synagogue. The reception that he meets is rather interesting. These people know a lot about Jesus. They can tell you about his origins, they can tell you about his family, and what they find is that Jesus knows a lot of things. In fact, Jesus is rather powerful. They know a lot of facts about him, but they lack the one thing that is actually needful, which is faith. As one commentator points out, there is a kind of disconnect. How did the Jesus we know and grow up with come to this? How can someone like that come from origins like this? In the end, the crowd found Jesus fascinating, but not one to embrace. They're asking, how could our Jesus have teaching, wisdom, and miracles? Their answer is that it is a curious situation. It's a riddle, but nothing more. He's not a figure that actually demands their faith. He's just an interesting riddle. How could a guy who's so powerful, who's so smart, come from origins like this little town? I don't know. They recognize who he is. In fact, I would dare to say that these are people who probably know more about Jesus than most of us. They could tell you a lot of details about Jesus' life. He grew up in their midst. It's actually the danger that we're in when we know a lot about Jesus. Those who are most familiar with Jesus are often those who least appreciate him. Those who read his words, those who go to church and hear his words, those whose lives even externally may center around him, often are the ones who least appreciate him. So it's a fearful warning for us. Mark's wording is quite unique. He says that Jesus could do no miracle there. He presents Jesus' power as being almost contingent, we might say, on faith in him. It's not, of course, that Jesus is limited in his power, but that he is, as it were, under special instructions only to do miracles in the presence of faith. And then in verse 6, he wondered at their unbelief. It's the only passage in Mark where Jesus is described as wondering or amazed. He's amazed that they know so much about him. They are so aware of his power, but they do not believe. It's incredible. They treat him as familiar. Jesus' words earlier, when he summarized the situation in verse 4, he said, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household." Basically, Jesus summarized the problem as this: familiarity breeds contempt. They have familiarity with Jesus, and it breeds contempt. Or as the saying goes, an expert is someone who carries a briefcase and comes from at least 50 miles away. And Jesus doesn't. So they don't care what he has to say. They don't put their faith in him. And as a result, he wondered at their unbelief. Knowing all this, they didn't place their eternal lives in his hands. They didn't place their earthly troubles in his hands. What a tragedy. So we've seen that Jesus' identity comes to light as he demonstrates his power over the natural realm, over the supernatural realm, and over death and disease. But further, his identity comes to light as he demands a faith-filled response. It's not enough to simply know these things. Jesus calls people to respond in faith to his identity. His identity demands a faith-filled response. So we come back to that question. Anyone can claim the authority that Jesus has. Lots of religions claim this sort of authority for their deity. But who can actually deliver the goods? Who can back up their words with actions? Jesus can. His identity comes to light through his actions. He really does have all authority in heaven and earth. And it is that reality, friends, that demands from us also a faith-filled response. Please pray with me. We are humbled, God, by the power of Jesus over all things. And may these stories remind us continually of his power, even in our own lives. He said before he ascended that all authority was given to him, and we know that that is true still. Please encourage us in our difficulties to put our faith in him. Ultimately, to entrust our own souls to him as the Savior. We pray this in his name. Amen.